they're just gone. So I have no footnotes. I'm very sorry.
Flexibility is everything about Tai Chi, so
Yeah.
without life.
The topic of my discussion was, does the has scientific research found that the slow movement and non-movement exercises of Tai Chi, are they related in some way to the cultivation of the Qi or internal energy? So I did a search with the help of research friends of mine who are very expert in subtle energy. Have any of you heard of subtle energy? Subtle energy are, very, very small microvolts of electricity that come from biological systems, living things. And so there is a great deal of research on subtle energy. And probably Qi is a subtle energy too, especially in the beginning stages. But obviously as Qi cultivation progresses, it's no longer very subtle. But, so I have a lot of friends who've done a lot of work with subtle energy. So they were not able to guide me to anything that they knew of, and they're very interested in Tai Chi. So I looked for some things myself, and I was very disappointed. There is a lot of research in subtle energy and how it affects consciousness and knowing, subtle learning or subtle knowing, i.e. intuition. But surprisingly, there's not really much interest or much investigation in does subtle energy cultivate? Does it gather? Does it thicken? Does it become more substantial so that it's not subtle anymore? It's something that we hear about along the lines of very accomplished Tai Chi grandmasters. And perhaps they can't get enough of a sample size, but I've seen nothing. Has anyone looked into that and looked around? Because there's so much information. No? Okay. So I did see one study that was very interesting, and it did say that non-movement and long contractions of the muscle do stimulate the production of direct current energy in the body. And from all of the my experience with Qi and Tai Chi and looking at what's known, definitely Qi appears to be direct current energy, as opposed to what comes out of the wall socket, which is alternating current, pulse energy like that. Qi seems to be a shedding, a pushing, a continual pushing of energy, direct current energy. So it was interesting to see this research on long contractions of the muscle, like we do in standing, or slow movements of Tai Chi, and seeing definitely a strong germination, a strong creation of direct current energy. To my thinking, I'm not a scientist in this field, I'm just enthusiastically jumping ahead, but it seems to me that there's a correlation there, that this is what we're talking about. This is the substrate, this is the foundation of Qi cultivation. Let me back up. I remember Russ Jaffe, an acquaintance of mine. He was an MD, PhD, very brilliant guy. He was in the group that did the original research that discovered cholesterol in the late 70s. And they came out with that paper that got us all worried about our cholesterol levels. And so later on they debunked their own research. They said, wow, your psychology is more important than your cholesterol levels, because they knew that monkeys in the lab, monkeys that did not do well in the lab psychologically, had a lot of problems with their high cholesterol, whereas monkeys that did do well in the laboratory environment had no problems with their cholesterol levels. So they said, there's something more here than just cholesterol. Anyway, that was Jaffe, and he was part of that group. And I remember that I met one of his colleagues, and they had done a lot of research on acupuncture. And they had been mystified by the effectiveness of acupuncture. And so they looked at it, and they said, there are three systems, three networks in the human body. One is neurological, a neurological network, the nervous system. One is an arterial network from the heart, and the other is a connective tissue network. And they said that all three of these networks are so dense and so fine that if you blew away all of the other cells of the body from the nerve network, you would see a perfect statue of the human being in front of you. Likewise, if you did the same with the arterial network, blew away all other cells, you'd see a perfect, look, like a stone statue of the person. You'd know exactly every wrinkle, every mark you'd know and see. And likewise with the connective tissue network. And so they used, they stimulated acupuncture sites, and they used enzymes to destroy the nerve tissue, and they found that the acupuncture site was still active. And they did the same thing with the blood. And then they did the same thing with the connective tissue. They used collagenase, because the connective tissue is basically sort of a crystalline skeleton of us. And so they used collagenase to destroy a bridge of the connective tissue, and that nullified, that neutralized the acupuncture site. So they said acupuncture appears to be changing the direct current bioelectricity of the human body, and that the avenue that flows through is that third avenue, which is the connective tissue system of the body. Have any of you seen this? Is this old news? No? Nobody? This is new news? Excellent. Terrific. Yeah, because that's from the 1980s. So there's just so much information, I think, that it's hard to keep abreast. So as I said, I looked around and was hoping to find some people who had done some research on the thickening of the direct current bioelectricity of the body, which is very well researched and substantiated. NIH has even done research on people. They sit them in a room and they copper plate the room, and they measure the nanovolts or microvolts off of copper plates in the room. And they can find that people who do meditation, who are accomplished meditators, can definitely light up enough bioelectricity that they can measure it on the plates. A machine can definitely measure human, consciousness or energy cultivation. It wasn't mentioned in that research paper, but I do know through my friends that the man who was most accomplished with this is a gentleman from Eastern Europe who has been in Bethesda since the early 80s, and he is an energy healer, and he teaches energy healing. His name is Mitak Verkus. And so he is in Bethesda, and he measures the highest levels. I don't think that they had any accomplished Taiji people there, but I think we have all heard that there's sort of two paths. There's the healing path of Qi, and then there is the martial path of Qi, and so it's kind of hard to, maybe they're separate cultivations. It's so hard to find people who are accomplished in either one, so finding someone who's accomplished in both, it's tough to find the sample size. So back to the research that I found, it found a definite correlation in the activity of direct current bioelectricity and slow movement and non-movement. So what they found is that Taiji-like movements, non-movement, even non-movement, and Taiji movement, when you couple together the theta states of meditation, bringing down the horsepower of the brain, bringing it down to a quieter level. When you do that, of course, the body lights up with this direct current electricity, and they think that this is one of the benefits of sitting meditation. So they found the same things happening with Tai Chi and slow movement and non-movement and the holding of postures, for example. So I find this fascinating because coming from the Zhengmenqing Yangzhen Fu School, Ben Lo is my teacher, 25 years. I don't know if their influence is very big in this area, so maybe many of you know this, but this is the whole centerpiece of hard work in this Yang Tai Chi, is holding postures and separating weight. That's the entire emphasis. So a bell was going off in my head when I saw this. So if I may extrapolate and now get away from the research, which unfortunately is quite disappointing. I mean, some early stuff, and just sort of expand upon it theoretically with my own experience. I do feel the way Qi behaves, it does seem to be that is the substrate of Qi, this direct current bioelectricity. It doesn't alternate. It's a substantial push, a sort of a coming together. My classmate, my older brother, Julian Chu, whose paper you heard today, he had a marvelous analogy that I really, really like. I don't know if it's his or if he borrowed it from somebody else, but it really is quite good. And he said that Qi seems to be like if you look at a magnet and the waves of iron filings or iron powder away from the ends of a magnet, and how it sort of becomes organized in layers or stratified, whereas other things that are not magnetic are just sort of this disorganized, chaotic cloud. I also heard about and I've not seen it, but still, it fits nicely in with this Qi cultivation. They did a test of the punching power of various people, very accomplished MMA professional fighters, and depending on their physical stature, they got a good punch on that punch machine. And then they had this gentleman who is internally cultivated from Nepal, and he did a punch, and it was all short punch, I believe. It was like 6 inches. And this guy's punch, the short punch of this guy who was internally cultivated from Nepal, was off the charts compared to everyone else. So, Professor Zhang, in his Zhengmenqing, in his writings, he likens the Qi cultivation to a layer of paper every day. He says, there's nothing less substantial than a single sheet of rice paper. But, when you lay one down, and then the next day you practice, you lay another down, and you lay another down. With thousands of sheets of paper, you have this, ream of, or a palette of paper that's absolutely unmovable and extraordinarily powerful. And of course in Tai Chi, what we can do with that palette of paper is we can move it. We can be completely neutral if we choose and absorb and neutralize that way. But the beauty of it is the energy is stored in that palette of paper, and then the palette of paper can, boom, give it back to the person that delivered it with extraordinary power. And in fact, I saw the note, I don't know what was said, but, about beating in Tai Chi, slow movement beating the fast movement. Maybe we can touch on that. I did find it very interesting that all of the extensive research on subtle energy in terms of information, I think is very interesting to look at in terms of Tingjin, listening energy in Tai Chi. So that the consciousness is extraordinarily active and engaged in the environment on an unconscious level all of the time. Researchers have definitely found this to be true. So perhaps, like the listening energy of Tai Chi is perhaps 2 things. Number 1, it's training, it's familiarity in a martial context, doing push hands for many, many years. Zhengmenqing said that to get Tingjin, that listening energy of Tai Chi, to know what the opponent is doing before they cue it, comes from many, many, many years of practice and familiarity. And he said the light touch, a light touch, very light touch, 4 ounces of pressure. So perhaps what Taiji is doing is through the meditation, we're quieting down the brain and at least the conscious brain, and giving a thinner avenue of the unconscious areas of the brain, which are picking up, the research has shown, are picking up this information. Our brain is just too loud to hear it. So perhaps as Taiji, moving towards enlightenment, as it does, that's what happens. That barrier between the unconscious and the conscious becomes thinner. And so it's partly that, and perhaps, as Professor said, the years and years, the right touch with that. I found that possibility very interesting in the research on subtle energy. How much time do I have left?
I think it's another 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if I have any notes here. Yeah. The researchers are, it's amazing, they talk very extensively. Oh, I wanted to apologize about my dress. Today's Mother's Day, so I was with Mom and the family, and so I mean no disrespect coming here in, Blanku, so like a kid, so please forgive me. So I found it very interesting to see the level, the thoroughness of the investigation on piezoelectric phenomenon. Again, this is direct current electricity, piezoelectric. When you bend any sort of material, you change the electrostatic potential. Any electrical engineers in the room, they're very familiar with this. So this happens with bones and muscle contraction. Anything will change that piezoelectric potential. So the long holding or the slow movement in Taiji definitely changes and stimulates that piezoelectric phenomenon. And one researcher in particular was dead on in terms of saying that this piezoelectric phenomenon can appear to gather in a sheet. And so it just, immediately as soon as he was talking about it, I realized, he's measuring chi. He is measuring this direct current bioelectricity. And my friend who brought this research to my attention, he said, well, this is it. This is it. This guy is talking about chi. This is it. And I said, no, that's not it. Because he is only talking about it's sort of becoming coordinated, and as Julian, that analogy, becoming stratified or condensed or streaming. That's it. It's streaming. But that's not all that Qi does. When I met my teacher Ben Low in 1975 on the advent of Professor Zheng Manqing's passing, and it was decided by the family that Ben, who was living in San Francisco then, had been told by Professor Zheng to go live in San Francisco and teach there, leave Taiwan and go to San Francisco. The family decided, Madame Zheng decided, that Ben should come to Washington and then go up to New York to preside at the memorial service for Professor Zheng Manqing at his school, Shizhong Taiji School. So we met Ben that night, and he later confided in me. He said, Professor Zheng told me never to show off. Never show off. And he said, I only showed off 2 times in my life. One was the night when Professor Zheng introduced me to the woman that he wanted me to marry. And he said, the other night was that night with you, when I went to Mr. Smith's, Robert Smith, his school in Bethesda, and I met you and everyone there. And there was 100 people in the room. And he said, and I showed off that night. And I was the youngest of Mr. Smith's senior students. So Mr. Lowe, when he was giving this jaw-dropping demonstration of his body cultivation and his chi power and his chi itself. I've told people, if you weren't there, you really missed something. Because my jaw was on my chest, as was everyone's else, and mine even more than other people, and I'll tell you why in just a second. Because I walked away with that and I said, God made the world far more complicated and far more interesting than I ever realized. And the human potential is far deeper than I ever imagined. And we watched his demonstration that night. Mr. Lowe insists on not being called Master Lowe because he always compares himself to Professor John. And so, we were just I remember somebody, blurted out in the middle of this, "You're Superman." And Ben said, "Oh, no, not Superman, super normal." And, we all laughed and said, no, you're Superman. So, just one last minute. He asked for a volunteer, all of the amazing things he did that night. He said he asked for a volunteer. So I just jumped up, I was quicker than anybody else. And I just arrived behind him, before he could refuse. And he said, "Okay, good." And everybody laughed. So, he quietly takes a leg like this, and he was standing here like this. He said, "Okay, you put your hands, on my bones here, above my bones, and sink your hands into my belly." And he was so relaxed. He was so incredibly soft that I squeezed in, and my fingers and thumbs could almost meet through his body. And it was just like he says, like a water bag. And then he said, "Now I will sink the chi to the dantian." And I felt this mass, just vibrating, super vibratory mass coalesce above my hands and hold there for a second and then sink down between my hands and just force my hands apart. And I was just, and my consciousness had a little dialogue with me, and it said, "This man is a force of nature. He can do with you anything that he wishes." And he said, "You can see from his face what he is feeling." So I said to my friend who said, "Look at this researcher on this piezoelectric phenomenon." He said, "This is it." And I said, no. That's very good. That's the beginning. But that doesn't explain how chi gathers and masses at the direction of the mind. The 3 levels of Tai Chi, where ultimately it gathers, it focuses, it can be condensed on a point. So Ben Lo is massing it, is this mass inside of his body, and can put it anywhere in his body, as if his body is a hollow thing. So gathering on a point. So this piezoelectric stuff does not explain that. So once again, the magic, the wonder of Tai Chi is still far beyond where we are in research today. Thank you very much.